Hi, Bill Urey again. This is our last month together. I'm so grateful to have this chance to share with you just a bit about the context of the Gospel of Mark. I hope that if you've read the articles or watched the videos, you could keep on going. I think it's a great start to why Mark wrote his Gospel. Remember in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, he says, without even a verb, the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's like, boom. But what is the Gospel? And what do I really apply to my life about Jesus Christ? Is he really the Messiah, the God-man who comes to offer his gospel life, his gospel reality to all of my life? And that explodes everything. It explodes everything he ever says. He's not just teaching ideas. He's talking about reality. You must apply these ideas to your life. He's not just healing diseases. He can heal me. He's not just calming storms for the disciples in the first century. He's the one who calms or brings peace to my life in the middle of a storm. And that's the whole gospel, is not just back there somewhere. It's how does that reality confront and then, I guess, combust, blow up every misperception I have about Jesus. The gospel always explodes every area of where my life is not like his and where I need him. And so we talked about last month, we talked about why Jesus was asleep. It's really a shocking thing. I think he was asleep because they didn't need him. Now, I want to end by saying that, and this might be a little weird for Bible study, but I've noticed, I went back and looked at every chapter, Mark chapter 1 through 8. If you know the Gospel of Mark, you know that it breaks at chapter 8 into a whole new thing. First 8 chapters, who is Jesus? Last 8 chapters, why does he go to the cross? So, who he is, the person of Jesus. Last 8 chapters, passion. Person is inseparable from passion. Christ, cross. You never understand Jesus. You'll never know who he is. You'll never comprehend any of his teachings, any of his miracles, anything about him, unless you know he's going to a cross. That's why he came. So from Mark 1 through 8, he's building a case, Mark is, and talking about Jesus. Who is this one? Well, he can deal with my illnesses. He can deal with death. He can deal with my fear, like the disciples in the boat. So what I did was I began to look for any word that had to do with boat or sea in the first 8 chapters. And I found, shockingly, that almost every chapter has something about water, boat, or Jesus dealing with our issues in a sea or boat or water. And I thought to myself, maybe Mark, I've never seen a book on this, maybe he's giving us some nautical theology, boat theology. And I stepped back, and there were 3 places where boats are talked about specifically in these chapters. Chapter 4, the one we're talking about, chapter 6, and chapter 8. And I began to compare the 3 stories, which is always good in Bible study to do. If you have comparable stories, boat stories, you ought to sit back and say, now wait, what's present in one and not in the other? So we've talked about 4 at length. You know the story. He's asleep. There's a storm. They cry out. In fact, they cry out so strongly that some people who are commentators say they were almost swearing at Jesus. Don't you care? Don't you care about us? Almost swearing at him. They're so angry, upset. So we know that context. He stands up, calms the storm, but he turns to them. And when he turns to them, he says something not about the storm, the physical reality. He talks about their hearts. He says, why were you afraid? Now that seems almost like a cruel question. Afraid? Well, anybody would be afraid if they're about to die. I think it's Matthew, maybe Luke says, the boat was breaking apart. So don't just have in your mind a picture of a nice little sleeping Jesus and a few water drops. The boat is filling up and the boat is breaking apart. No wonder they're screaming. They could die. Don't you care? He says, why were you afraid? Now that to me points to a very deep heart issue, which, let me just say it, as a salvationist, we are very concerned about. Most of the history of evangelicalism has been, how can I get forgiven for my sins? And it's a very important question. But Mark doesn't talk about that a lot until later. Right now, he's talking through the disciple stories in 3 boat stories about their hearts with the Savior. He doesn't say, I want to forgive you. He says, why were you afraid? Because there's something in their hearts. They just are so self-centered. They will not really believe who Jesus is. In fact, he says in another miracle story, how long must I be with you? I often think to myself, I've known Jesus for 45 years. How long do I have to live with Jesus before I really believe, really walk as if I know who he is? It's an important question for life. So that story we know. Now move to 6. It's very intriguing to me. It's another boat story. They're in the boat. Jesus says a pretty freaky thing. He says, I'll meet you on the other side. Now, he knew how he was going to get there. They didn't know. He knew he was going to walk on the water over there. That's already wild enough. But they're without Jesus physically in the boat, same boat probably, well, a boat like the other one, going across the water. He's not in the boat and a storm comes up. That's interesting to me. It's like a mother teaching her children. Wait a minute. You saw what I did. I was just there with you in the boat physically. Someday I won't be with you physically. When you're in a problem without me, what are you going to do? What do? They freak out. Not one of them calls out on Jesus. They don't know him. They don't want him. They're going to die. And when he comes toward them, remember this story? He comes toward them in the storm. He's walking on the water. They think he's a ghost, which is intriguing to me. They know Jesus. They've lived with him. They've watched his body every day. As he comes close, now I know it's on a storm and he's on the water. That's not normal. But let me just say, they saw a ghost and not Jesus. I'm just intrigued by the detail that Mark gives to us. They don't recognize Jesus in problems because problems are they're huge. Like, I'm going to die here. So our automatic response goes back to what I said last month, is self-sufficiency, it's pride, it's the way I've done stuff, not tilting my life toward Jesus. Now, of course, he calms the storm with one word. So you got 2 stories, very similar except for one difference. He's not in the boat. The next story is in Mark chapter 8, that pivotal chapter now. So I think we're getting someplace. Mark is settling who Jesus is for us in 8 chapters, but he's also pointing out our deepest problem, a heart problem. My sins are issues, but my sins come out of my heart. If my heart is not changed, I'll keep on sinning. I'll keep on being self-sufficient and prideful, which is the source apparently of every sin. I don't need Jesus. I don't need anybody. I'll do life by myself. Now, the third story. He's in a boat. This time there's no storm. Okay, storms are pretty freaky. You can make people believe in Jesus if you've got cancer, if you've got, a drought, if you've got famine, a war. There's no storm here. No problem. He's just fed, if you think about these chapters, he's fed 5,000 men, which means 15,000 people at least, with 12 baskets of leftovers. He's also fed 4,000. So 5,000 one chapter, 4,000 next chapter, which means 12,000 people, 7 baskets left over. They're in the boat, 13 men, and their concern is not a storm. There's no storm. Their concern is, what are we going to do for lunch? And that to me may be funny, but it challenges me about my day to day, and maybe yours. I wonder how many of us have said this morning, Jesus, without you, I don't know how I'm going to get lunch. I don't think we think that way. I think we know food's there. We're going to get it, buy it, fix it. We just do life in 100 different ways today. Never thinking once about needing Jesus. Never. Needing him. So, there are 13 men. They have one loaf. He's just fed thousands with leftovers. They have one piece of bread. And Jesus says, guys, have you learned nothing from the loaves? They're afraid about lunch with the one who's just produced a miracle of that magnitude. Now, we can say they're dumb or stupid, but every time I come to this chapter in Mark 8, I think, wait a minute, Lord. I mean, I prayed this morning. I've been to lots of church services. I've been in ministry for a long time. Do I have a heart like these guys? Am I really? Would you look at me and say, have you learned nothing? And sadly, in many situations like temptations, like relational problems, like anger in life, resentment for people who've betrayed me, I tend to be more like them than I want to be, the disciples. I'll just fix this. I'll make this right. I'll do it. And the Lord says, have you learned nothing? I wonder why, and with this I'm done. In Mark chapter 8, the very next thing that happens is Jesus comes to a blind man and has to touch him 2 times. Why is that story right next to this third boat story? Let me say something that I can say only to Salvationists probably, because this is really off. This is our theology, and a lot of people think we're crazy. We're not, but they think we are. We believe in entire sanctification. We believe that before Jesus comes again, the human heart can be so transformed by His grace, His presence, and the Spirit's presence in our lives that we can fully trust Him. We can believe everything He said about Himself, everything He ever did, and that He rose from the dead to send His Spirit to every believer. But most of us will, if we're honest, will say, when I was forgiven for my sins, I had no idea what walking with Jesus was going to be like. I had no idea He wanted every decision, every relationship, every pain, every resentment. I didn't know that. I thought I could be resentful and still follow Jesus. I thought I could be in charge of my future and my relationships. And Jesus says, have you learned nothing? Even if you don't have a storm today, what have you learned about Jesus? So to have this story about the blind man, only time Jesus touches a person twice, I'm thinking maybe there's something there to say, for most of us, we've been touched because we don't want to go to hell. So I want my sins forgiven. Touch me, Jesus. Okay, He does that. But then He begins to move into other parts of my life, and that's where it gets really, really weird. Like, you're correcting my good works. You're correcting my sense of love. You're correcting everything I ever think about. You want to lead my life where? I didn't want to go there. And Jesus says, but I want you there. And He has to come again in some way. And I don't want to be strange about it. But there's a secondness in Christian life. I don't know if it's one moment or one day or 1 year. I don't know. For you, I know for me, it was a critical moment where I was doing my own thing, wanting my own way as an evangelical Christian. And Jesus said, Bill, you don't know me. You want to go to heaven, but you don't want to know me. And I made a decision. By His grace, He enabled me to make the decision that day to say, Lord, my entire life is yours. And He exploded everything in my life in a good way. I look at my life most days and think, my wife, my 4 children, my 6 grandchildren, the people God's given to me in the church and now in the Salvation Army, the best people I've ever met in my entire life, all of that came because of that exploding moment. And there was a secondness to it. He touched me a second time. I didn't know the first time what He needed to get access to. The second time, I could see clearly. Now, I'm still seeing clear. I'm growing every day. I'm learning more about Him every day. But without that second touch, I still would be fuzzy about the whole thing. And I'm intrigued. With this, I'm done. I'm intrigued with the disciples in a boat wanting lunch with the one who just fed thousands of people. And Him saying, have you learned nothing about me? And a blind man who says, now I can see. I really see who Jesus is. My prayer is that this Mark's exploding gospel will explode every old thing we've hung on to, which I think the Spirit wants to do, and said, let's get back to the full gospel of Jesus Christ, the only gospel. And that is one where we see Him for who He is and we follow Him with all we are. That's exciting to me. Thanks for letting me share. Lord bless you. Bye-bye.